As a designer, what do you think about the idea that was pushed forward by creators like Thebausffs and MidBeast some time ago? They said something like it might be the best interest of the game to be in a consistent state of unbalance to make it more fun. Do you fear the fact that League might become too balanced? I mean, my opinion on that is just the generic thing of like the most objectively balanced game isn't the best game. Like that's just my opinion. Like if we define objective balance as literally every character has the exact same power level and every item has the exact same power level or whatever, right? Like I just think that's a worse game, like straight up. It's to me the best game is the game that feels the most enjoyable and exciting and fun to its players. And what I've learned over the years with design is the most balanced things aren't necessarily the most fun, and the most balanced game is not necessarily the most fun. A really easy example of this is, some characters, really fun to play against, need to be a little overpowered to be seen. Okay, that's a true thing for some characters. Fun to play against, need to be a little overpowered to be seen. If they're weak or truly balanced, they just don't feel powerful, and then no one plays them. That's an example of a character that you should make overpowered. Because again, if a character is fun to play against, and needs to be overpowered to be seen, fun to play against means it's probably good for the game, right? So that's an example of that's a character you should make overpowered, which means that the objective balance would be that you have a character who's overpowered, right? Yeah. And then additionally, there's characters who are potentially, say, really fun to play. Fun enough to play that if they're a little underpowered, no one really cares. But potentially they could be really rough to play against when they're strong, right? And that's an example of a character who probably at the end of the day wants to be a little on the weak side. Because they're still really fun to play, but if they make the game, worse in certain ways when they're too strong, then you probably want to be more deliberate about their tuning, right? And then also there's an idea of, I think this is one thing that perhaps Thebausffs and MidBeast were getting at too, where it's just when a game is super balanced, it doesn't feel like there's potential for discovery. There's kind of the idea that if Riot knows how to perfectly balance their game, and they have preemptively perfectly balanced the entire game, then what's the point of trying new builds? What's the point of trying characters in new roles, right? I say it all the time in the stream, but there's a character in mid right now that we know about and you don't know about that is overpowered. And if we were making the perfectly most objectively balanced game, what we should then do is go nerf that character right now. But what do we get out of doing that? Right? That character isn't causing the game to experience problems. They're barely played, right? So nerfing it would probably just make the people who play it kind of depressed, and would make a lot of people who play the game be like, why are you nerfing that character? That character is fine, even though I'm telling you right now, we know that character is overpowered. And so to me, it's a better thing is just well, let that character chill, right? And let people discover it. Let people know that there are things in the game that if they found them, they could win more with. They could get an advantage with. They could try some new crazy stuff with, right? I think the game is better when there's things like discovery, right? The chance that there's some build that people don't know about that shifts up the meta. The chance that there's some character combination that makes bot lane have a completely different experience. Those things I think are really valuable. But again, if the game was objectively perfectly balanced, it would mean they would need to be nerfed. And, that's probably not the best version of the game.
I really like feats of strength. Why do they remove mythics completely instead of adding more options? So, I explored a number of options. One thing is that you'll hear, if you watch August, for example, you'll hear him say things like, mythics could have been good if we could have had more options. What I'll say is that as a systems designer who's worked, I think I'm actually the person who's worked the most on the item system, certainly in the last 5 years, maybe ever. More options would have helped Mythics, but it would not have solved all of the problems, right? It would have solved, I think, one of the bigger problems, which was that we didn't actually have Mythics for everyone, right? Kayle, Katarina, Singed, Rumble, etc., right? there were a lot of champions that were not happy with the Mythic options that they had, and a lot of champions that really only had one Mythic that they could buy, which wasn't really, which was sort of contrary to the goals of the Mythic system. So yes, from that perspective, adding more Mythics would have helped. However, one of the things I'll say is that just more items wouldn't have solved the problem, and even if we decided that we were okay with like 10 more items, 10 wouldn't have been enough, right? We would have needed to like literally double the number of Mythics to the point where the system wouldn't really have made sense. Like we would have needed to have maybe just as many Mythics or maybe even more than regular items, and at that point the system starts to break down and doesn't really make sense, right? We sort of lose a lot of the values of Mythics in the first place when we have that many. But there were just a lot of other problems with Mythics, right? Like, great example of one of the fundamental problems with Mythics was Everfrost. It's kind of like, okay, so how do we get mages to buy a cool Mythic that isn't the one that gives them the most damage, right? Because the other options we were offering between like Ludens and Liandry's was which one of these is going to give you the most damage in this game. Okay, so how about Everfrost? Okay, this is a utility option. In order to make it Mythic levels of power, it has to basically guarantee your skill shots land. Oh, actually, if we give you something that guarantees your skill shots land, champions like Ahri can't be fun. Like Ahri cannot be allowed to be fun when Everfrost is in the game because we can't make it so that landing her charm is useful or powerful because her charm will always land. So she has to be this really, really, really flat experience where Ahri goes forward, your charm is always going to land, and we know from a balance perspective, your charm is always going to land once you get your Everfrost, right? And it's like items like Everfrost, I think, are the best example of like why the Mythic system was kind of broken, where the amount of power we have to load into these items breaks some patterns that we need to have to support the choice structure. And so ultimately, Mythics just ended up being such a problem in a number of different ways, both in that we couldn't really make enough of them to cover all the use cases we needed, and also that we needed to like have things that were so powerful that they were warping champion kits, and also even some things that weren't too overly warping, like Divine Sunder is a good example of this. So like ended up being, they became a motivator to pick champions, and they became, even if they weren't overly warping for your kit gameplay, they became driving reasons why champions would be picked and played in certain ways, which is like, oh, I'm not picking Wukong because I want to play Wukong. I'm picking Wukong because Divine Sunderer is good on this patch, and he's the best Divine Sunderer user, which is a really, really, really dark path to go down, which is really rough. There were just a lot of different problems with Mythics that we didn't have the ability to solve, or if we had solved them, the game would have been worse for it. So ultimately, because League, we've decided, is a champion fantasy forward game, Mythics fundamentally interfere with champion fantasies at the level of power that they had and at the level of power that they needed to make sense. And so I think maybe the number one problem, maybe the number two problem after the fact that we didn't have enough Mythics to cover all of our users. But I think that, to me personally, the warping of fantasy to become more about systemic fantasy rather than champion fantasy or character fantasy was the biggest problem with Mythics. And that was not a solvable problem. Because without the level of power that they had, Mythics don't make sense as a system. And so if they have that level of power, they have to be kit warping in some ways and character fantasy warping.